Hello, my name is Emma Tobias, and my big comfy chair is very squeaky right now, so it might have been a mistake to set up everything this way, but we're gonna roll with it. I'm gonna talk about my favorite books that I read in 2018, also talk about my most disappointing reads, maybe some opinions that were, I don't know, less than normal. We'll just see what happens. First off though, general reading stats, if you can call them that. I read 53 books this year. My average rating was like 3.7, so it was an above average reading year. I read a lot more books than I thought I was going to, and from my last video you would know that is because of audiobooks, ebooks, and the library, so shout out to those guys. So yeah, it was a pretty good reading year. I read a lot of really random genres, and I also read a lot of popular books of the year. Like, I read a lot of 2018 releases, which is not something I've done ever. Normally I feel like I'm still like catching up with like popular books because I did start reading at a later age, but now I'm kind of caught up a little bit, or I don't care as much anymore, so I can kind of follow the trends. So I thought I would talk about some of my disappointing reads first. I have them on these really just fantastic, these aren't all disappointing reads, on these really fantastic, very professional note paper. Some books that I found really disappointing. My reread of Anne of the French Kiss was not disappointing in the fact that I knew it wouldn't be good, but my reaction to it was disappointing. I still kind of expected it to give me warm fuzzies, and it did not deliver, so that was a bummer. I also found my reading experience of The House That Groaned to be one of the worst reading experiences I've ever had. It was one of the worst books I've ever read. It's a graphic novel that uses sort of this idea of dramatic, disgusting imagery to be artsy, sort of vying at Dadaism and failing epically. It was terrible, and I hated it and would not recommend it to literally anyone. So those were two of my worst reading experiences, but one of my most disappointing reads was a book called The Startup by Dori Shaffir, I want to say is her name. And this was so bad. It's a book about the startup culture in New York City. It's a fiction book. It was just terrible, and it was incredibly anticlimactic, and it felt like the entire time she was trying to be hip and cool with social media language and tech, but it felt like she was trying. I do think the book is well written. It got a lot of praise from like the literary canon people, and whoever they are, but I just didn't like it. So those were probably my most disappointing reading experiences. But all in all, like, I really didn't read a lot of books that I hated. Those are just the three that really stood out to me. For books that I found disappointing in the fact that I didn't love them as much as I wanted to, there were quite a few of those, and most of those were kind of the popular books of the year. The Kish Quotient, I felt like the pacing was really off, and I found it to be really hard to get through at times. While I still really enjoyed the concept and the romance, I do think it will adapt really well into a movie, which I think I heard it's going to happen. But just the pacing issues weren't really good for me, and the miscommunication trope is something that I find really hard to read. But it was a 3-star book because despite those two issues I had with it, it was still really good and really interesting and really different, and I enjoyed it a lot. Another book that I thought was disappointing was Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor. A lot of people really loved this book, and I don't have a problem with that. I think for me it's mostly that I don't read a lot of fantasy anymore, or really ever, and I just found it kind of just difficult. I like the characters, the world building was really great. I mean, I have no faults with the book, but I think for me, I was disappointed that my kind of aversion to fantasy in some ways still is there. I just found it kind of slow. I did read it pretty quickly, I just didn't super like it. And the reason is because I don't really like fantasy, so it's kind of completely my fault. It was a 3-star book though. Another book that is fantasy that I did not enjoy as much as a lot of other people is The Cruel Prince, which was a 3-star book. I thought it was good. I enjoyed it. I thought that people are slightly overselling the whole Cardan thing. Like, yeah, he's bad, but I didn't really find him all that alluring. And maybe that's just me, like, my specific opinions about stuff like that. But I thought he should have, I don't know, like, I didn't get the vibe that he was, like, he was a really bad guy, but that's the only thing I felt. And maybe it's just I don't like that trope. That's a big part of it. Like, when someone is being abusive, even if there are reasons behind it, they're still being abusive, and I just don't really enjoy that kind of romanticization of that. But at the same time, like, if that's your tea, if that's your cup of tea, go for it. So that was like a 3-star. Another book that was a 3-star for me was The Wedding Date. I feel like it had the same problems that the Kiss Cushion had. The pacing just wasn't for me, but I did enjoy the characters and the writing. And I think both The Kiss Quotient and The Wedding Date really shows that, like, these writers are gonna have really great careers and write so much great stuff. And I'm excited to read The Proposal, which is the next book that she wrote. But I liked it. Okay, so moving on to some sort of honorable mentions. Vision of White by Nora Roberts was the last book I read in 2018, and I really loved it. Previously, I had read a book called Pride and Prejudice and Mistletoe, which I didn't even bring up in my least favorites because I didn't finish it. It was truly garbage. It's by Melissa De La Cruz, and it feels like she wrote it in about 30 minutes while she was in the parking lot. And I hated it so much. So I was kind of like soured by romance because I was like, this book was so badly written and badly plotted, and the characters were terrible, and it was just awful. Vision in White is part of the Bride Quartet series. It's about 4 childhood best friends who own a bridal business, and the first book is about the wedding photographer, and she falls in love with an English teacher who had a crush on her in high school, and it's incredibly sweet and kind of flips out a lot of ideas on its head. You have the female character being the commitment phobe, and then you have the male character being the least toxic masculine man I have read in a romance book in such a long time. If you like soft boys, this is definitely kind of the book for you. Soft boys with like a hint of like sexy underpinning. Yeah, this is the book for you. Down Among the Sticks and Bones, which was a surprise because I didn't really like Every Heart is a Doorway, but I really love this book, and I specifically love the way that femininity is discussed in this book. There's kind of a feminine binary. You have to be a tomboy, you have to be a girly girl, and this book really kind of explores that, and I really like that. So those are just kind of a general look at my reading this year, and now we'll get into my favorites. So I got my stack right here and my squeaky chair. I'm going to start off with nonfiction. So the first nonfiction book that I loved was The Diary of a Bookseller by Shawn Bythell. This is a book I read when I was in London and when I was in Paris. So the reading experience of this book, the experience of reading this book was quite choice. I read part of this book in front of the Eiffel Tower, which was super cool. So maybe that colored my opinion of it and made me like it even more. But regardless, I loved it. It is a nonfiction book about Shawn Bythell and his bookshop called The Bookshop in Wigtown in Scotland, and it made me want to go to Wigtown, 1, so it's a great advertisement for Wigtown, but 2, I love this book because Shawn Bythell is very honest. He's just talking about his day-to-day life working and owning a used bookstore. It's really funny and witty, and every person he talks about feels like a real character. They almost don't feel real, but they do feel real, and it made me just appreciate all the work that goes into a bookshop. Also, Warm Fuzzies. Gave me the warm fuzzies. A book related to this is The Bookshop Book by Jen Campbell, which I read at the very end of this year. The Bookshop Book is mentioned in The Diary of a Bookseller, and The Diary of a Bookseller mentions the bookshop. The Diary of a Bookseller, no, the Bookshop book mentions the bookshop from The Diary of a Bookseller. Anyway, so they're all interconnected. The Bookshop Book is a sort of almost travel log, kind of, where Jen Campbell takes you on a literary journey and to some of the world's most fascinating and interesting independent bookstores all over the world. And it made me feel really happy and appreciative, and it was really sweetly written, and also made me cry. So, 2 of my favorite nonfiction books. Another favorite nonfiction book I read this year was Priest Daddy by Patricia Lockwood. I listened to this on audio, which I think is a good way to consume this book. Patricia Lockwood is the writer, and also it's about her life, and also she does the audiobook, so it's a really great combination. This book is very salacious. She gets into so much deep, interesting, controversial topics, specifically about religion, Christianity, and the Catholic Church, because her father is a priest and became a priest by circumnavigating the system, even though he's married and had kids. But she does it with so much humor and weirdness. It's a very weirdly written book. It's a very weird book with its metaphors and its references. I loved it. I genuinely loved it so much from beginning to end. I think it's one of my favorite books I've ever read, and definitely my favorite memoir I've ever read. It's like poetry, and you can tell that Patricia Lockwood is a poet because it's written so beautifully. I really loved it, and that's all I'm going to say. It's probably the book that I would recommend the most that I read this year, although it is not for everyone, and it's a book that I wouldn't say everyone should read, but if it interests you, I definitely would give it a read. Or a listen. Okay, moving on. Another nonfiction book I love this year on my post-it notes. I listened to an audiobook, and that's Bad Blood by John Carreyrou. A lot of booktubers talked about this book, specifically Liz, not Liz, oh my god, I'm terrible, Emily from Possibly Lit talked about this book. Liz from Liz Love Lit, if you're watching this, you should read this book if you haven't read it. I don't know why I was thinking about you, but this is such a great, insane story about this company called Theranos, who was a blood testing company, and all the shady crap that happened behind the scenes of Theranos' development. It's truly wild, and it's really a portrait, I think, from when I was listening to it, like, it's a portrait of, like, what white women can do when they're just, like, use every part of their privilege possible. It feels like this is a book about a white woman who's just using that to benefit herself, even though she has nothing to back it up. It is a really well-written book. It's investigative journalism, and I loved it. It was crazy and interesting and beyond anything I thought was possible in business, but that tells you that I'm fairly naive. Okay, next we're going to move on to some middle grade, meaning 2 middle grade books, which are my favorite, probably warm fuzzy books I read this year, and I read a lot of those. And that's Nevermore, The Trials of Morgan Crow, and Wondersmith, Calling Morgan Crow by Jessica Townsend. I feel like these are on a lot of people's lists because they are so good. People compare them to Harry Potter in terms of the way they made them feel, but I didn't read Harry Potter as a young person. I read it as a young adult, so it's difficult for me to compare it to anything. So the experience of reading it was incredibly special because there's nothing to compare it to, really. It's so wonderful, and the world building is truly fantastic, and I think this is going to become, I think if enough people pick it up, which I hope they do, it's going to become like a children's classic series and middle grade series, and I love both of these. I almost love this one more. It's also really dark, but dark in a way that feels complicated. Like, it's not black and white necessarily, the good and the evil, especially in Wondersmith. It's so explored, and I really, really, really appreciate that. It's incredibly nuanced. Loved it. Love both of them. Next, we have some YA. I have 2 favorite YA books. The first one is The Bells by Danielle Clayton. This is probably my favorite YA fantasy debut I've read in a long time. What's interesting is that I don't really love fantasy, but I really love this book. And this book is like fantasy, but in a specific, dark, social commentary filled way. I'm not saying the other books I talked about aren't, but both of the books I'm going to talk about are fantasy in a way that like really connected with me. And I can't really quantify that or qualify that, but it's there for a reason, I think, or there is a reason for it. The Bells is incredibly smart. It's funny. It's twisty and strange and beautifully written and illustrated, and the world building is fantastic. And if you're not a big fantasy person, I would give this a read. And also, the implications of the world building and the structure of the world it's so rich and fascinating, and I'm really excited to keep reading in this series. So excited. Next we have Lair of Dreams, the sequel to The Diviners by Libba Bray. I love The Diviners and I love this book. I like to say that this series is what Fantastic Beasts could be if J.K. Rowling researched more and cared more. It's diverse without feeling like Libba Bray is just trying to be diverse for publicity. It feels incredibly pertinent to today's society while also taking you back in time so intensely, and the characters are all incredibly rich, and it is a fantastic series, and I love Lair of Dreams specifically. So far, my favorite out of the two I've read. Well, I've read half of the third book, but we'll get there. And then next we have some romance. The first book I don't have with me because it was an ebook. That's The Hating Game by Sally Thorne. This is not a perfect book, and it definitely has problems, but I loved it. It made me really happy, and I think the romance is really fun and interesting and sexy, and I just loved it. I loved it, and I've recommended it to a lot of people who love romance for that reason. And then another favorite romance book I read this year was One Day in December by Josie Silver. I read this book in a day. This feels like a classic British rom-com, but in a book. It's like if they took One Day and made it not sad, you would have this book. Like One Day and Love Actually put together, but less sad. This is so good. And if you like kind of long, slow burn romances, this is your book. I devoured it and loved every second. It's also very funny, which I'm always about. It's not cringy funny, it's just very funny. So love One Day in December. And then we have one graphic novel, well, specifically graphic memoir, Something New by Lucy Nicely. I love Lucy Nicely. I've read all of her books, and all of them are my favorites. And this is a book about her wedding and wedding planning and being a bride and all of the social implications and the history of that makes her uncomfortable, but all the joy and happiness she feels about marrying her best friend. It's fantastic, and her art style remains my favorite art style anywhere. And then finally, one of the first books I read this year, and definitely one of my favorites, obviously, is Little Fires Everywhere by Celeste Ng. Celeste Ng is an amazing writer. She's like writing these modern classics, I think. This book explores race and suburbia in such a insanely great way. It's compulsively readable while also being gut-wrenching, and I adored it, obviously. So that is kind of my year of reading and my favorites. Let me know what you guys think. The next video I'm going to do is my goals, including some books I want to get to next year. Trying to be organized 2019, but probably will fail. Anyway, have a lovely day. Bye.